Okay, you don't really have to look much at that rather cloudy map, but this one is a little clearer, and it shows you a bit more clearly the region in which we all live. I'd like to start, first of all, by just referring very quickly to a definition of geopolitics. And to the topics that we're going to be talking about this evening. After reflecting very quickly on geopolitics and the relevance of this concept to the Caribbean, I want to flag a few very important geopolitical issues, especially those in which major changes have taken place over the past year. So, this is something pretty basic. It simply says that geopolitics is a method of foreign policy analysis which seeks to understand political behavior, drawing heavily on geographical variables. We all know what some of those are, and political identities and actions are somewhat, not entirely, but somewhat determined by geography. And geopolitical factors are not fixed. They change over time. And so they influence international relations in different ways over time. Now, these days, as was referred to by the people who spoke before me, geopolitics is being redefined and has become relevant again in the context of globalization, and also, and particularly in the context of the ecological challenges that the entire globe is facing and that affect us considerably in the Caribbean. Critical geopolitics, which is also a la mode, is also important, I think, to us in the Caribbean because it explores alternative narratives. It seeks to look at perspectives other than those of major state players. And since most of us in this region are not major state players, we are, of course, interested in techniques that look at alternative narratives. Now, in the Caribbean, it is impossible, in fact, to avoid some resort to geopolitical frames and considerations. We have so many, as you saw in the screens before, we have so many small and very small territories, both among the islands and in Central America. We have the proximity of several much larger, very powerful actors. We have a post-colonial legacy of European interests in the region. We have the environmental, political, and economic strategic significance of both the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans, the Caribbean Sea, and the transoceanic Panama Canal. We have a tremendous distribution of natural resources, including strategic minerals. We have our island's fragile ecology. And finally, we have human geography processes, such as migration. And geopolitical factors and geoeconomic lenses help us to understand the historical roots of many of our contemporary territorial disputes in the region, and they also help us to be more conscious of the developmental challenges of vulnerability and resilience building that face most actors in the region. And here you can see some of what I've just been referring to. You can see the Panama Canal there on the right-hand side, well, my right-hand side of the screen. We can see the multiplicity of island actors. You can also see the multiplicity of jurisdictions in the region and of different types of sovereignty, different variations on sovereignty. And in the next screen, you can see most of our very powerful neighbors. Canada is not represented there, but the United States is there, Mexico, Colombia, Venezuela, and Brazil, our much larger and much more powerful neighbors. And this shows you some of the conundrums that result from being largely in a marine environment and having so many countries very close, territories very close together and lots of different jurisdictions. Now, some of this is a screen that shows some of the low intensity, mostly low intensity, and some territorial disputes that have been adjudicated and that have been settled. But it gives you an idea of how, in a region such as ours, which is not that big, there are tremendous complexities of geography and territory. And there are many, many disputed areas within the Caribbean Sea. Now, let us go on to speak about, well, in a minute we're going to come. Let me go back to where I was before. I don't really want to be there yet. Most frequently, the geopolitical reflections on the Caribbean region take place from the perspectives of the more powerful state actors in the region. The United States, of course, has a gigantic strategic footprint in and around the Caribbean Sea. Canada, Mexico, Venezuela, Colombia, and Brazil have all, to varying degrees, established their presence and their interests. Several European powers have overseas territories and/or deeply rooted interests in the Caribbean. These include Britain, France, the Netherlands, and Spain. Russia has a dramatic past of engagement in the region and is again very much present in the area. China is an emerging global and Pacific power and has multiple forms, historical and actual forms of engagement in the Latin America and the Caribbean. But it must be recognized, that smaller territories, it's okay, I manage. Smaller territorial actors in the region also have their geopolitical interests and objectives, which they pursue as part of their own survival and development. So, as I showed you earlier, I'm going to try to speak briefly on, in fact, it's not 8, it's 7 major geopolitical issues which have emerged or intensified during the past year. Some of the themes overlap or intersect with each other, and so they're discussed in tandem. And so we start with the US political shifts and policy drifts of a crucial power in the Caribbean. So, proximity to the United States is one of the most significant geopolitical realities for the Caribbean region. That is often sometimes referred to as the US third border area. And there I list just some of the major areas of dependence and interdependence between the United States and most countries in the Caribbean. So, most Caribbean countries, not all, but many, export between 35% and 80% of their total exports to the United States. In addition to that, the US enjoyed last year a trade surplus of over $6 billion with many of these countries. The US is still the largest source market for tourists who come to the Caribbean. And it is also the largest recipient country for Caribbean migrants, 60% of whom head there. And people of Caribbean origin make up approximately 9% of the immigrant population in the United States. The World Bank tells us that in 2014, remittance receipts from Caribbean migrants in the US, excluding Cubans, excluding Cuba, is estimated as amounting to 8% of the GDP for Caribbean economies. And so it's not surprising, therefore, that Caribbean countries are very sensitive to whatever happens in the United States. The third border themes, and in fact the themes which characterized relations during the last US administration, included cooperative agendas on security, law and order, health, ICTs, economic growth, of course, and disaster management. The change of administration in January represents change rather than continuity. It represents abrupt changes to much of this shared agenda. The Trump administration is pursuing a strongly nationalist agenda of America First. This focuses largely on promoting US domestic issues and priorities elsewhere in the world. And apart from a few very important areas, it's largely indifferent, I would say, to Latin America and the Caribbean region. But there are some central issues that are, in fact, very important for the Greater Caribbean area. These include its anti-immigration policies, the rollback of the US-Cuba normalization process, the deepening of sanctions against Venezuela, the renegotiation of NAFTA and the poor relations with Mexico, its climate change skepticism and its withdrawal from COP and other climate change mitigation commitments that the US has previously had, and significant reductions in its multilateral development funding. These are all realities which have implications for countries in the Caribbean. Significant implications. We can discuss some of them more in depth later, but I would just refer to a couple of things. Ron Sanders, well-known writer and of course a Caribbean ambassador in Washington, he refers to the fact that criminal deportations from the US to the Caribbean for the first 6 months of 2017 almost equal the total number of such deportations in 2016. There is the unresolved issue of the 800,000 DACA young people, a few thousand of whom come from the Caribbean. The US has also revised its policy on skilled immigration, reducing both the number of places and the window of time granted to foreign graduates trained in the US to be recruited there. The US is backing away from some of its commercial relations. Most centrally, there are changes, or there is a lot of uncertainty concerning NAFTA. What we are finding, though, is that this is generating renewed interest in the Caribbean and elsewhere in Latin American Caribbean trade flows and in trade between Latin American Caribbean region and the Pacific region. The other theme of major anxiety for the Caribbean has been the US administration's climate change skepticism. Caribbean countries, Caribbean and Central American countries, have been engaged in an energy security and clean renewable energy cooperation with the US since 2014. And there was quite a bit of anxiety about the continuation of support for this program. What seems likely at the moment is that those Caribbean renewable energy projects which have the potential to provide commercial opportunities for US enterprises will be supported, will continue to receive support. There was funding granted for a wind farm, an offshore wind farm feasibility study in Jamaica a couple of weeks ago, which gives an indication of that. Most Caribbean countries will be affected by the significant reductions in US multilateral development and the reduction of programs as a result in UNDP, in UNICEF, and in various other programs from which people in the Caribbean benefit. Now, I want to switch really to speak about Cuba, and here I'm speaking partly about US-Cuba relations, but also about Cuba, some very important developments within Cuba itself. Now, what a difference a year makes. 1 year ago, the focus of attention in US-Cuban relations was us trying to keep up with the pace of the cooperation agreements being signed, 23 bilateral agreements, the tremendous surge in movement of people between the two countries, and the remarkable increase in investment flows and entrepreneurial activity in Cuba. And of course, the evidence of widespread political and social changes within Cuba. Reactions in the rest of the Caribbean celebrated the normalization, while also somewhat anxiously examining possible repercussions for some of their own economic sectors, largely tourism. Many Caribbean countries searched for ways of strengthening their own cooperation with Cuba so that the new directions might prove beneficial to the region as a whole. The Trump administration's moves to roll back some of the increased social and economic exchanges with Cuba, announced in June 2017, have major implications. We have seen the announcement of interdiction on commercial activity involving the Cuban military or intelligence. We have seen increased monitoring, new bureaucratic hurdles needed for non-Cuban US nationals travel to Cuba. And most recently, a serious political crisis triggered by reports of mysterious illnesses of US diplomatic staff in Havana, to which there have been consistent Cuban denials of involvement, the withdrawal of numerous US embassy staff, and the expulsion of 15 Cuban diplomats from the United States. Now, although the new economic restrictions are not sweeping, together with other difficulties facing Cuba at the moment, the costly recent hurricane damage, the impact of the Venezuelan crisis, they will contribute to continued economic stagnation and a bit of austerity for the Cuban population. Cuba increasingly explores other economic partnerships. Chinese and Russian investments are growing. Another aspect, another major development that was triggered by changes in US policy were that in 2015 and 2016, you had huge increases in Cubans leaving Cuba and trying to get to the United States. This was triggered in anticipation of the Obama administration's announcement that in January 2017, the wet foot, dry foot special admissions policy for Cubans would come to an end. Cuban immigration would thenceforth be treated just like immigration from any other part of the region. Now, what that meant is that the Cuban arrivals in the United States went up by 78% in 2015 and a further 10% on that in 2016, about over 40,000 in each year. Many Cubans now remain in countries around the region, caught also by the tightening of US immigration policies. Mexico recently granted 6,000 residence visas to Cubans who have been unable to cross the border there. Cuba finds itself at a sensitive political juncture. It is approaching a date in 2018 when President Raul Castro has announced that he will step down from power, he will retire. And this is expected to be the first handover to somebody who it comes from a post-revolution generation, somebody who was born after the Cuban Revolution took place in 1959. So this is a very significant juncture in terms of Cuba's internal processes, and one which all of us in the Caribbean need to be conscious of and need to acquaint ourselves with. Now, Cuba has very solid relations with its neighbors. It has made very impressive contributions to Caribbean human and social development since the 1960s. Cuba has played a central role in regional cooperation. It has very strong diplomacy. It has an excellent foreign service, and it has maintained a positive image throughout the Caribbean region. Ultimately, there is a regional desire to see political and social stability and to see economic advances continue in Cuba. There's a phrase that was used by a minister in Jamaica. He said, "A rising tide lifts all boats." So neighbors prepare themselves not only for that rising tide when it eventually comes, but to adapt to a new generation of Cuban leadership. One from which they expect that there will probably be more pragmatism, more focus on Cuban economic growth, in line with the expectations of the Cuban people, and an expectation from Cuba of increased reciprocity from the rest of the Caribbean, mixed with the solidarity. This is in line, all of these are in line with the policy shifts that were announced by the Cuban administration that were agreed in the lineamientos legislation in 2011 in the Cuban parliament. Now, we move from Cuba to Venezuela. Venezuela is another very important and very central Caribbean actor. As you can see, Venezuela has a very long Caribbean coastline. It's 1,700 and something miles. Venezuela has major stakes within the Caribbean Sea. That is where its oil and gas sector is concentrated. It has major fishing interests as well. It is always concerned with the security of its trade routes. It has a very extensive, exclusive economic zone that goes up almost as far as Puerto Rico due to its offshore islands. Venezuela is particularly close to Trinidad, to the Windward Islands of the Eastern Caribbean states, to the ABC Islands, Curaçao, Aruba, and Bonaire, and of course to Guyana. And Venezuela has, for many years, dating back to the 1960s, been very central in regional cooperation. Now with Petrocaribe, ALBA, CELAC, and earlier with the ACS, with Caribbean Development Bank, and many other regional institutions. Venezuelan governments, for many generations, have shown an interest in being a Caribbean country and in playing a fulsome role within the Caribbean region. Now, this gives you an idea of the proximity. This is Cuba, this is Venezuela and Trinidad. Trinidad is closer to Venezuela than it is to Tobago, 7 miles or less at these points. There's extensive mobility. People come across and go across all the time, and there are close links, close family ties between the people, for example, in Cedros in Trinidad and the Venezuelan coast. 2013 to 2017, 3 very important agreements for both countries for joint gas exploration and development were signed and are being implemented. Trinidad is anticipating that by 2022, there will be increased Venezuelan gas deliveries, which are very much needed for powering the industrial sector in southern Trinidad, which does not operate at full capacity due to some energy needs. There have also been bilateral agreements on commercial exchanges over the last couple of years, and Trinidad sales of food and consumer items to adjoining Venezuelan provinces. Now that is a relationship of cooperation, largely. The Venezuelan-Guyanese relationship is laced with more conflict than cooperation, but nonetheless, they are neighbors and they negotiate. They discuss their differences in varying intensity. Now, relations began to deteriorate around the end of 2013. The Venezuela's territorial claims were reactivated. Relations have chilled in tandem with Venezuela's internal difficulties, with the advent of a new administration in Guyana in 2015, and they culminated in Guyana's withdrawal from Petrocaribe and an end to the trade in rice that had been ongoing for some years. Now, one of the irritants has been Guyana's significant petroleum discoveries in the Essequibo maritime area. This is, of course, the area of dispute that is claimed by Venezuela. Latest developments I'm sure you're all aware of, the UN's appointment of a Norwegian mediator, and Guyana has opted for adjudication by the International Court of Justice at the end of 2017 if those mediation efforts do not make much headway. It remains to be seen if ICJ adjudication will go forward. There is a significant major power dimension because of US and Russian commercial interests. Rosneft's involvement with petroleum interests in Venezuela, with PDVSA, and ExxonMobil, an old actor in Venezuela and a newer actor in Guyana, leading petroleum development in Guyana. So that gives an additional, possibly complicating dimension, but possibly also the Russians may have the capacity to play a mediating role with both countries because of their ability to speak with both countries. Who knows? Venezuela had a very turbulent first half of 2017. And by the second half of 2017, things cooled down a little bit. But Venezuela, there were over 100 people who have died over the last 3 years. Venezuela had decided to withdraw from the Organization of American States. Now, there has been regional and international criticism and concern expressed at events in Venezuela but it has stopped short of activating the Inter-American Democratic Charter. However, there have been 2 declarations by a group called the Lima Group in August and in September, which basically call for political dialogue, observation of human rights norms, and the resumption of an electoral schedule. Regional elections were held in October. The Socialist Party of Venezuela, the governing party, won overwhelmingly, won 18 of the governorships. Opposition allegations of fraud, but not substantiated. And in fact, the election results seem to have generated greater divisions within the opposition over their strategies going forward. There has been tremendous suffering of the Venezuelan population. The convergence of economic difficulties have led to a precipitous decline in economic and social well-being. And there has been a very large-scale exodus of people to other countries in the region, most notably to Colombia, Panama, Brazil, Peru, Chile, the United States, and also to the Dominican Republic, Trinidad, Curaçao, Suriname, Venezuela. Some of these territories are fragile in the face of immigration surges. Colombia, of course, as we know, is undergoing a sensitive peace-building reconstruction process at present. Venezuela will probably suffer medium to long-term losses of human capital, as its most highly skilled are those who are most likely to gain residence elsewhere. There have been high levels of capital flight. Some of this has brought benefits to some regional territories, I have no doubt, to Panama and to the Dominican Republic. The rise in domestic instability in Venezuela has also overflowed into neighboring territories. I think many countries would agree that there has been increased activity in the trafficking of arms, drugs, and human beings. As for regional responses, there has been a paralysis or a limited effectiveness of regional organizations in the face of the scale, the sheer scale of the Venezuelan crisis. There are deep divisions among regional actors due to their cross-cutting and diverse forms of engagement with Venezuela. Venezuela's neighbors have geographical or geopolitical proximity or distance. They have differing domestic sensitivities to the impact of Venezuela's widening crisis. Some are highly indebted to Venezuela for its support programs over the years. Some have ideological affinities, others have ideological differences with Venezuela. Some have crucial economic interdependence with Venezuela. Most adopted solidarity in light of the US threats of military action. And many have a desire to protect their regional organizations from the destabilizing effect of the Venezuelan crisis. And some have other homegrown difficulties which have complicated the forging of regional consensus or proactive responses of leadership. So what all of this shows is just how central a player Venezuela is in the geopolitics of the Caribbean and Latin American region. For 2018, it would seem that the Venezuelan administration will weather the storm. There are crucial elements. Venezuela's ability to meet debt repayments. You would note that the government has recently called for debt reconstruction talks. The impact of US financial sanctions, especially the most recent ones. Venezuela's continued support from major creditors like China and Russia, the continued support of the armed forces, the cohesion within the governing party as they move towards presidential selections, the opposition's capacity to maintain its unity and momentum for the long term, the population's resilience, and finally, the stance of many regional states. Most regional states do not wish to see violent chaos in Venezuela. In general, they prefer negotiated settlement, they prefer bipartisan cooperation, and they prefer constitutional regime change if regime change were to happen. So, those are my thoughts on Venezuela. There may be other interpretations. I wanted to mention Brexit and the position of Caribbean overseas territories, the UK Caribbean territories. This will strike a chord with you in Curaçao because you are also overseas territories of the European Union. When Britain voted to leave the European Union in 2016, it posed daunting challenges for UK territories, not only in the Caribbean, but UK territories elsewhere as well. The European Union is a very important trade and development cooperation partner. The Brexit situation has highlighted the disadvantages in international affairs that are faced by the overseas territories. They relate to the UK through the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. They have no representation in the British Parliament, and they are indirectly associated with the EU through Britain. Now, their benefits are many towards the EU. They benefit from participation in the EU institutions for the overseas territories. It is a welcome source of international visibility because they do not have much international visibility. They have regional visibility, but not international. Now, the EU provides market access for their goods and services. It provides development support. There is freedom of movement to continental Europe. And importantly, there is also freedom of movement, and there are commercial exchanges with other EU territories in their immediate vicinity. Look at the case of Anguilla. Anguilla's closest neighbors are French and Dutch St. Martin. Most of Anguilla's trade and its transit, its travel is through Dutch St. Martin. Now, several of the Caribbean OTs are major exporters of financial services to the European Union. Bermuda, such services, insurance and reinsurance, this activity accounts for 98% of its GDP. Financial services make up 41% of the Cayman Islands' GDP and 13% for the Turks and Caicos Islands. In the case of Montserrat, Anguilla, and TCI that have lower GDP than the others, they have benefited considerably from European development funding to the tune of 37 million euros during the last European Development Fund. And they have no other sources of ODA apart from the British government. The wider group benefits somewhat from climate change mitigation funding also. So the OTs, the overseas territories, have a huge stake in the configuration of Britain's post-Brexit relationship with the EU, and talks are not going that well. The hard Brexit prospect is negative for them, as it is for other actors. There are major questions on future sources of development support, and I think the current test case is the reconstruction of the BVI and Anguilla post-Hurricane Irma. There are major questions on future access to EU financial markets. And for Anguilla, Anguilla needs to negotiate regional access arrangements with the adjoining EU territories. This is an important niche where an organization like the OECS can play a facilitating role, and I think I may be wrong, there was an association of Caribbean, European Union, overseas territories. I would think that this is a situation where such a group can also play a facilitating role. I'm from St. Kitts and Nevis, and once upon a time we were St. Kitts, Nevis, and Anguilla, so have to put a plug for Anguilla. Right, I'm almost finished, almost there. Now, I wanted to mention a couple of geopolitical aspects of severe weather, and I wanted to conclude with energy security. Now, this was the path of Hurricane Irma, and you see its extensive impact, and this was the path of Hurricane Maria. And 2017 hurricanes probably cost 300 billion US dollars. Now, this is the latest chapter. The IMF estimates that since the early 1960s, each year there are losses of approximately 1% of GDP per annum in the Caribbean from natural disasters. For individual countries, the year that a hurricane strikes and several years after, the debt to GDP ratio increases significantly. And there is no real let up for us. Recent projections predict that greater intensity and the inclusion of more Caribbean territories within the vulnerability zone for future hurricanes. I know that Trinidad is supposed to suffer from that. Now, the consequences of this year's hurricanes probably mean downgraded GDP projections for the next few years for the northeastern Caribbean, and more disturbingly, a deflection of capital from crucial infrastructural investments for Dominica, for example, its geothermal development, to immediate post-disaster reconstruction and rehabilitation. There has been and there will be a huge migratory impact. The Puerto Rican residents flowing out to the United States, French territory residents to other French territories or to the metropole, migrant workers in St. Martin and in the BVI and elsewhere back to their home territories, and the temporary protection that has been provided for nationals from devastated countries that has been extended by many countries in the OECS and other CARICOM countries, Bahamas, Trinidad, etc. The last I heard, there were 75 school children from BVI and Dominica at school in St. Kitts, for example, and that's just one of them. The security effects. Initially, there was a law and order breakdown in St. Martin. There was a prisoner escape in BVI. And in most of the dependencies, reinforcements of metropolitan security forces were necessary to assist with the rule of law and also with rebuilding. Now, what are the lessons that we can take away from this disastrous hurricane season? First of all, the broad scope of the international relief response, from the EU to Venezuela, to USAID, to regional governments and private individuals, diaspora communities, international agencies, etc. And this has to be an ongoing part of our foreign policy in the Caribbean. Maintaining a presence, maintaining links with all these networks that we need so often, and also providing our own solidarity when it is not our turn. Again, as was stressed by the Director of Foreign Affairs, the paradox of middle and high income small states and territories which have high vulnerability but limited access to concessionary funding for rebuilding. The resurgence of debates about weaknesses in governance capacity, which has certainly become a theme for discussion in a number of places. And the obvious need for new resilience measures, more insurance, more reconstruction support, new building codes. We never had Category 5 before. And also, I think the hurricanes have demonstrated the value of our regional institutions, even if they are small scale. They have still played a useful role. Last area, just a few comments on energy security in the Caribbean. The 21st century has taught us has put energy security high on our policy agenda. The CARICOM energy program has a target of having 47% renewable energy by 2027. That's a very high mountain to climb, since in 2012-2013, renewables only accounted for 8% of CARICOM's energy. All these countries have significant deficiencies in the provision, in reliance on fossil fuels, in being high-cost energy producers, in having large segments of the population without access to electricity due to geography and income disparities. Many countries are focusing on geothermal sources, but others are focusing on wind, solar, and biomass. The constraints are much the same. Funding gaps, the search for affordable and reliable investment partners for the startup costs of geothermal plants, and distribution pipelines. But despite the difficulties, these are very important long-term initiatives for regional energy security and for our sustainable development goals. And it is to be hoped that new investment partners will be found. China has a major climate change section in its new Latin American and Caribbean policy of 2016. Let us see if that will extend to some geothermal and other renewable energy financing. The other side of energy considerations, of course, concerns the new oil and gas discoveries. Most significant in Guyana, which is projected by 2020 to produce at least 120,000 barrels per day. But of course, this is also a very high-risk transition time for Guyana. Guyana has been on a low-carbon development path for the last 2 decades. There are major implications for other sectors of the Guyanese economy. Major questions about the maintenance of balanced growth, about protecting the marine and land environment. There are major challenges of internal political risk and of conflict potential with Venezuela. Undeniably, there are immediate or short-term opportunities for economic growth, for Guyana's exercising much more regional leadership, for strengthening the human development possibilities for its population. But there are tremendous challenges of putting in place legislative safeguards, financial and human resource development arrangements for this new era that seems to be coming rapidly. So, to conclude, I'm sure you're all very relieved that I've actually reached a conclusion. So am I. So, just to recap, there are major shifts in US policy. We are seeing the withdrawal of the United States from its traditional levels of multilateral engagement. We are seeing policy shifts in important areas of global and regional policy, and less focus on the partnership programs with the Caribbean. But nature abhors a vacuum. As US engagement is reduced, we will see an increase in the role of other strategic actors. And right now, increased roles of China and Russia are very much on display across the Caribbean. It has been a turbulent, crisis-riddled year for Venezuela and for its neighbors. And there is still an uncertain outlook for 2018. Cuba suffers various setbacks as it moves towards its 2018 presidential transition. There is ongoing uncertainty about Brexit, but one thing we can be clear about, it is unfavorable for the interests of the British overseas territories. Hurricane destruction in 2017 will have negative impact on regional growth, probably for the next few years. It will make for demographic shifts, which will be either temporary or longer term for the next few years. That has happened with every hurricane that has hit the Caribbean since the 19th century. It will fuel, though, post-disaster economic growth for some, drives for greater resilience, search for new partners, and it may also stimulate some governance adaptations, particularly in some of the overseas countries and territories that have been affected. We are in an exciting era of new energy-related developments, both in fossil fuels and in renewables. Now, all of these geopolitical and geoeconomic developments have implications for the foreign policy behavior of all the countries in the Caribbean, for regional cooperation, for national development directions and emphases, and for the economic risks and opportunities that are available, both to large-scale private sector players and small and medium enterprises, but also to the populations, the societies, the people who inhabit the Caribbean zone. So thank you very much for your attention.
Maybe you have some questions for Professor Byron Reid?
Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
Yeah, my question is based upon the management disasters in the Caribbean region. I heard you say regarding the policies of the governments of the territories in the Caribbean region, maybe that's the fact that create on missing that disaster management. For example, in geopolitical.
Not so, yeah, that's not working. The mic is not working. It keeps, you know.
Is the question clear?
Go ahead.
It's based upon the management disasters was announced in the first chapter of the presentation. And I heard you say it about the deficiencies of the governments in the regions, from the countries in the region, the Caribbean region especially. Maybe that's a fact that create that misleading of the management disasters. Look what did happen lately here in the Caribbean region.
Well, two things. I think that I noticed when I looked at the statistics from the disasters, the death toll was much higher than it normally is. I think at least 94 people died across the region. Highest numbers of deaths were in Puerto Rico. I think Dominica had quite a few deaths as well. Now, for some countries, you know, there's an organization called CIDEMA, Caribbean Disaster and Emergency Management. So, CIDEMA has done quite a good job over the years in improving the preparedness and the protocols that go into both preparing in advance and responding to disasters that strike over the years. And generally, the populations in the countries that belong to CIDEMA, not all of them, but many of those countries are better prepared than they were before. And we have seen in our region, with the exceptions of some countries, generally the death toll, the property destruction is bad, but the death toll is generally lower than in many other regions when you have natural disasters. I think that this year showed up the ongoing weaknesses in disaster management capacity in many territories. And that is something that will have to be seriously looked at. It is obvious both at the national level and in terms of regional cooperation. A lot more training, a lot of reviews have to go on, a lot more training has to take place as to how to prepare for a natural disaster. For instance, well, I lived in Jamaica for 23 years. And in Jamaica, you always declare a state of emergency before a hurricane hits. Because if people have been evacuated and if nobody's on the street, of course you are going to have people trying security incidents. So you always have an enhanced security presence before a disaster strikes. You don't wait until after. You do it before. That did not happen in all the territories that suffered from Irma and Maria. So I think now it's interesting, SIDEMA has the largest membership of any regional organization. It includes quite a few of the overseas territories, not all of them. It includes the British ones. Not sure about the others. But I think if there is one area that Caribbean people experience in common and can agree on, it is vulnerability to natural disaster, and it is one area where we all can work together. So obviously it is an area where not just governments, because even if the government is falling down a bit, you have to look out for your own salvation. If you have trees over your house, you need to cut them. If you need to prune, you need to do, the population has to be schooled in everything that has to be done in order to keep life and limb during and after a natural disaster. So I agree with you that it's an area for a lot of work.
My name is Charles Cooper, Parliament of Curaçao. Since you mentioned, and we all know that the BRETEX will be a fact, then the OCTs will also have to change, the OCTs status. Mm-hmm. And that may impact also us in Curaçao because we are part of the OCT. Now, there was discussion a long time back, OCTs versus ultra-peripheral status. Can you say something about that?
Well, okay, now, yes, but before that I want to clarify something else. The overseas countries and territories, of course, your status vis-à-vis the European Union does not change. Your status vis-à-vis Britain will change, and if you have extensive economic relationships with Britain, well, you would be affected by whatever post-Brexit market arrangements are worked out between the European Union and Britain. It will affect some territories more than others. It depends on the extent of your dependence on the British market. Now, there are some places, some overseas territories in the Caribbean that do have the RUP status, which is the ultra-peripheral status. And those are the French departments in the Caribbean. It has, as far as I'm aware, both advantages and disadvantages. They benefit from much higher levels of financing from the European Union, but in return, they don't have any flexibility in terms of deviating from EU market regulations and norms. So it means, well, the department say it all, well, not the French regions in the Caribbean say it all the time, that it makes them less competitive in terms of regional trade because they have to maintain European labor norms, they have to adhere strictly to all of the European norms. So you get more money, but you get less flexibility. So I'm not sure that you would have the choice now because Curaçao certainly has quite a different constitutional status. But I think I am not an expert in European law, but that I think is a crucial difference.
I also have a question. I am an expert in European law. I'm the Dean of the Law School here at the University of Curaçao and Professor of European Union Law. So my question is also probably more legal as well. I was also triggered by the Brexit discussion. Also because a couple of weeks ago the House of Lords published a report in which is analyzed the impact of the European Union minus the UK to most of the British countries and territories. Most of them are either dependent upon subsidies from the European Union, or their trade is mostly related to the European Union, not going to the UK.
Exactly.
Yeah, so it is, so they are very worried. Also in the Overseas Countries and Territories Association, they have expressed that recently. And for instance, you mentioned Anguilla. And Anguilla is, still doesn't have a treaty with the Dutch and the French for the maritime borders. So there are still negotiations there. So they are very worried about what's going to happen. The BVI has not had any British subsidies since the 60s. So they are completely independent. So it's not just their relationship with the European Union, but what do you see for the possibilities, for instance, for them becoming part, for instance, of or independent?
Okay. By the way, there is a report that was done on Anguilla. You may be aware of it, by the West Indies Committee, in which Anguilla's peculiar situation is outlined. And I fully agree with you. I think the consequences are most dire probably for the Malvinas, Falkland Islands, Malvinas, because of the extent of their trade with countries in the European Union, with Spain and with others. Most of their fish exports are there, and they would have considerably higher tariffs to pay. And, well, Gibraltar's situation is completely up in the air, for example. Now, many of the British overseas territories do have a relationship with CARICOM. They are associated members of CARICOM, and they are also associate members of the OECS. In the case of Montserrat, Montserrat is a full member of the OECS. It is possible to gain what is called, negotiate an entrustment with the British government to have some competence in regional policy. The French have their own version now, slightly different. But Montserrat negotiated an entrustment in order to be a full member of CARICOM and of the OECS, and to be a member of the economic protocol of the OECS. BVI chose not to do it, although BVI's constitution allows it to have the same thing. Because BVI has a lot of concerns about immigration, it does not want to have free movement between itself and the rest of the OECS. So it prefers to remain an associate member under the former Treaty of Bastia, but not sign on to the revised treaty. All of them are associate members of CARICOM, where they participate in the heads of government meetings. They belong to some of the functional cooperation areas, but they are not part of the single market of CARICOM. Nor have they shown any particular interest in being part of that. But they do benefit from the functional cooperation. Now, in terms of their future relationship with Britain, I suspect that in the wake of Brexit, there will be a more conflictual relationship in various ways. And that is also going to be probably a feature of relations following these hurricanes. Because BVI never needed assistance from anybody before, but it certainly will in terms of rebuilding its space. Montserrat was totally independent economically until Hurricane Hugo and the volcanic eruptions. And Montserrat has not had a friction-free relationship with Britain since, but at the same time, it is budgetarily dependent. Can't do much. Montserrat cannot go anywhere. I have been looking for statements, and what you see, the tone that you get, is that they're not contemplating independence yet, that they continue to seek wider forms of autonomy, but they don't really, nobody really seems to be thinking independence would be in their best interests. The OCT that could step out tomorrow would be Bermuda, but Bermuda has not chosen to go that route. Now, incidentally, Bermuda is in the best position in terms of a relationship. It has an institutionalized relationship, I can't remember what it's called, with the European Union. It has a presence in Brussels, which is something that none of the others have yet. So Bermuda is better placed than the others to defend its interests in financial services. But I don't expect to see a massive exodus and independence of these territories. But they will keep on pushing the envelope, trying to get more autonomy, I suspect.
Okay, I have an observation. You describe a map of geopolitical map of the Caribbean, and I think it will be very important if you also that in the Caribbean, Latin America, we're talking about 70 military bases of the USA. And my question is, what is the influence of those military bases around the Latin America? In Curaçao, we have also military bases, USA military bases. There are many opportunities as used to do some flights in Venezuela, etc. And another observation, the lessons to be learned of the hurricanes. I think the first lesson is that the real politics of the dominant power countries to the colonized, to their colonies. For example, the denial of USA against Puerto Rico, and the way, in the way of the Netherlands, they use these opportunities to force some anti-democratic law to St. Martin. the Netherlands use in some way a barter deal. I will help you, but you have to implement some anti-democratic law. Dus I think the lessons to be learned is the application of a disaster neo-colonialism. This is my observation, and my question is, what is the influence of the military bases for the geopolitical moves in the Caribbean?
Thank you for your question. Well, first, just on the example you gave of St. Martin, that is not out of the ordinary. It's not extraordinary. If you look at the case of Montserrat, since Montserrat became 100% dependent on British budgetary support, Britain has also imposed much more its financial regulation, its legislative control over Montserrat's internal affairs. This tends to be a feature of accepting financial support from the former colonial, or well, not former, from the metropolitan power. I did not emphasize it because I take it as a given. The United States is the major strategic power in this region. The United States has, since 1898, sought to be a major strategic power in the Caribbean. And every territory in the Caribbean, certainly every small state in the Caribbean, has to learn how to negotiate in a vastly asymmetrical relationship in terms of security with the United States. The military bases are there. The United States will follow its own interests. And I think that many of us in the region have learned in various situations what is a worst case scenario. For example, a worst case scenario is Grenada in 1983, where somehow you managed to end up with a US invasion of your territory. So you learn as you go along, hopefully not by very unpleasant, very disastrous circumstances like that, to negotiate from a position of weakness and to try to maintain at least 50% control over your territory so that you do not become completely subject to the interests and the agendas of vastly superior military powers. In the dialogue, you have what is called a security dialogue between the United States and a number of territories in the Caribbean. It's not an equal dialogue, but the Caribbean has tried to put some of its own interests with varying levels of success, sometimes no success at all, on that agenda for annual meetings. Now, those meetings have waxed and waned depending on what administration is in power in the United States. You had a more cooperative relationship during the Obama administration, although there were still conflicts of interest. I don't hold out much hope for major security or commercial or even commercial partnerships in the current administration. I hope I am wrong, but it does not look very encouraging. But at the same time, we live next to the United States, and that is a geopolitical reality. And so we have to try to work out a modus vivendi with our neighbor. That's the way I see it. Finish? No.
What is the role of Dutch? What is the role? I see a major limitation of the Dutch territories in the Caribbean.
But I should be.
I don't feel it. So in some organization, in the geopolitical aspects.
Well, I think you mean in regional cooperation? Well, again, I think this is an answer that you can get. What you're really asking me is what is the perception of the rest of the region towards the Dutch territories. I imagine that is something I can answer. Okay, the Dutch territories, in terms of regional institutional cooperation, are probably most present in two organizations. One is the Association of Caribbean States, and the other is ECLAC. And there, the Dutch territories are visible, and the Dutch territories play a very positive role in some areas, often in cultural cooperation. I think the Dutch territories are extremely important in economic exchanges in the Caribbean. St. Martin, well, until its present devastation, from which it will recover. St. Martin is a very important economic hub in the northeastern Caribbean. One of the students in my current master's class in Trinidad, she was coming to class late after the hurricane, and she told me, you know, we are under a lot of pressure. Our head office is in St. Martin, and because it's in difficulties at the moment, we are picking up the tab here and collaborating with them. No, St. Martin is the head office for subsidiaries in Trinidad, for example. St. Martin plays a tremendous role in transportation, in communications, and in services trade in the region. Curaçao plays a much greater role in this part of the world. So I think that the Dutch territories are perceived as having a particular economic facility, as being the interface between a number of economic actors. And they're also seen as being very, very flexible and fairly competitive in terms of service delivery. That is what I would think. I'm not an expert on the area, but okay.
Thank you, Professor Jessica Byron Reid. Yes. I would like to invite the soul of LACIGS, Mr. Humphrey Senior, for some closing remarks.
Good evening. Since the protocol has been served already, I want to address myself to speakers and participants for the program of this week. I thank you for joining us at this second winter course, what is this, of the Latin American and Caribbean Institute of Geopolitical Studies. First of all, I want to present my deepest appreciation for this diverse variety of academic colleagues, political decision makers, and policy officers that found their way to this course. We are greatly honored and pleased to have in our middle this week eminent speakers from Europe, from Latin America, and from the Caribbean, as we just saw, participants from different disciplines. Welcome also students from abroad, Bombini, and I welcome also our local colleagues who honor it with their presence. The second University Winter Course on Geopolitics is organized by LACIGS in collaboration with the Intercontinental University of the Caribbean, And we are very grateful to both the Intercontinental University of the Caribbean and the University of Curaçao to host the WINTERCOURSE. The conference management team and coordination staff of LACIGS have done an outstanding work preparing this WINTERCOURSE. I would like to thank them for their energy, their competence, their patience with me, and professionalism exposed during the organization process. Leonora, already know, Johan Aldeboom, our Master of Ceremony, Zaida Lake, who couldn't make it today, and Frank Ehlenberg, the most important person. He is our administrator. I also want to thank Mr. Wiebe Smith, that was my right hand, assistant coordinator of this course, who did an outstanding job communicating with you. He did all the correspondence with participants and the speakers, almost, also Lian, of course. I also want to thank the Secretary General of the Ministry of General Affairs, who again this year made a good job in coordinating our efforts to reach the ministries to enable for them to join the course. Thank you once more. One of the aims of LACIGS is to promote the study of geopolitics by young scholars. We do this by sponsoring the participation of students through corporate sponsorship. A special word of thanks also on behalf of the students goes to the Maduro and Curiels Bank, who sponsored this year's students' participation. Though we have to say that funding the course still is a major challenge. That's the reason why we are very grateful to the group that also this year volunteered to organize the course. Please, participants, consider to be on the organizing team of the 2018 edition of this course. The objective of this course of study is to introduce the main concepts of geopolitics, geoeconomics, and economic intelligence from a multidisciplinary perspective and to lay the basics for the geopolitical method of analysis. In addition, we aim to bring theory and practice together in an in-depth, state-of-the-art geopolitical update of Latin America and the Caribbean. The role of geopolitics in policy development of state, sub-state, and non-state actors is assessed. The participant will be familiarized with fields of thought, methods of analysis, policy development and forecasting that comprise geopolitics, geoeconomics, and geostrategy. Participants will experience geopolitics as a valuable instrument in the decision-making process and the basics to apply the geopolitical analysis method in different situations and integrate this in the decision-making process. The course still remains an introductory one. We encourage participants to go on with the study of geopolitics and international relations. It had been mentioned already by the General Secretary. Hopefully, in the near future, Curaçao can offer such a study at the master level. On Friday, after the presentation of the research papers of the students, we will hand out the certificates to all the participants who attended. And I also want to inform that the roundtable of Wednesday will be at the University of Curaçao, not at ICUC. So all the roundtables will be here tomorrow, Wednesday, and Thursday. So that some people ask where it is. So all the roundtables are here. Okay, I want to thank you very much for your presence. Have a good night, and tomorrow we will see each other at the same room as we did today. Thank you very much, everybody.